Nevertheless, this is a very lucrative industry for companies that sell medicinal mushrooms with all kinds of claims about their effects, their efficacy in treating conditions that are very sort of mild conditions, but also even life-threatening diseases, terminal illnesses. It's an area of, I suppose we'd call it mycology, but it drives me crazy because I don't like to see mushrooms and mushroom science misrepresented in this way. These magic mushrooms have escaped their countercultural association, and there are many voices that suggest that these compounds should be used as a part of mainstream medicine for treating conditions like.
So hello and welcome to the Sheekey Science Show, where in this video I spoke with Nik Money, Professor of Biology and Western Programme Director at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Referring to himself as the mycologist, Nik is indeed an expert on mycology and has authored a number of books that celebrate the diversity of the microbial world. In his research at Miami, he has pioneered the use of high-speed video microscopy to understand the explosive mechanisms used by fungi to launch their spores into the air. In this discussion, we discuss what fungi are, whether they are intelligent, and how compounds formed within mushrooms could affect our health and our brain. Hope you enjoy. So, hi Nik, thank you for joining me today and welcome to the Sheekey Science Show.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, no, thank you. And so the reason I brought you on is because I recently was reading your book, Mushroom. And so besides being an academic, you've also written many books which have helped to educate on a variety of interesting topics, in particular your area of research, which is mushrooms and fungi. And so to take a quote from your book, you describe mushrooms as being the most wondrous invention of the last billions of years of evolutionary history on Earth. And so I think most people probably know what mushrooms are, but what are fungi? How would you describe them?
Yeah, I mean, they are the most brilliant of evolutionary inventions, just because they eclipse us, humanity, in so many ways in terms of their beauty. I'm not a big fan of Homo sapiens, but I do love the fungi. What was the question? So what are the fungi?
Yeah, what exactly are they? What are their defining characteristics?
Defining characters. So the fungi represent, as we classify them, as a separate kingdom of organisms and a vast and diverse group of eukaryotes. So their cells are constructed like ours, complicated cells with nuclei. And in fact, fungi and animals are regarded as sister groupings of eukaryotes. So humans, other animals, are more closely related to fungi than they are to plants and the other great chunks of biological diversity. What are they? So they feed by absorption. They either grow in the form of filaments that we call hyphae, and so hyphae penetrate their food materials and they branch to form colonies that we call mycelia. And so that's the vegetative part of the life cycle of these filamentous fungi. But fungi also grow in the form of budding yeasts. And they tend to grow as yeasts, or rather fungi that are yeasts tend to grow in more fluid environments. And then they absorb food from the surrounding fluid environment. So that describes at base their cellular form or morphology, filaments or yeasts. But then using those sort of elementary cellular forms, they've diversified into an extraordinary group of organisms, some of which, or a few tens of thousands of species, form mushrooms, fruit bodies that are macroscopic. But the majority of the fungi are microscopic, and many of them we only really know that they exist from their genetic footprints. We really know nothing about the way that they look and very little about the way that they grow. So there's this sort of vast invisible diversity of the fungi that we know from their genetics, but we don't know much about them. So What else? We refer to microscopic fungi that don't form mushrooms, or many of them. We refer to them as molds. And so they're everywhere. Mold spores are in every breath we take. There are vast numbers of these, megatonnages of these spores in the atmosphere. So I find that particularly interesting, that it's a kingdom of organisms with which we interact every moment of our lives, but for the most part, we're unaware of their existence. And then we might talk about this later, but the human body is home to a glory of fungal diversity. There are fungi that grow on the skin surface. There are fungi that grow in our reproductive tracts. There are fungi that proliferate in the gut, all of the passages of our respiratory system. So I love that feature of the fungi, that they're amazingly diverse, and yet they're unseen for the most part, other than mushrooms and purple.
Yeah, that's well said. And the thing is, so what fascinates me most is how we're more similar to mushrooms than like mushrooms are to plants. And so I was just wondering, like, what got you fascinated about mushrooms, and what kind of features of mushrooms have you mainly been researching?
Yeah, I mean, it was. I'm a product of affirmative action. I went to a large comprehensive school as a teenager in Britain, in Oxfordshire, but I got into a great university. I was an undergraduate at Bristol. And one of the first lectures that we had in biology was given by this mycologist, a lovely professor called Mike Madeline. I really knew nothing about fungi before that lecture. And afterwards, it's like I was completely hooked. I had no idea that these amazing organisms exist, and he presented them in such an attractive fashion. So that was my beginning. Back in, when was I? 1980, I went to university. So I just turned 60 last year. I've forgotten what your question is now. Was this a fulsome autobiography?
It was great. I was asking, what got you interested in mushrooms, which you kind of answered, and then what kind of areas are you studying?
Yeah. So I've most of my work has really been, I've done some biochemical work on fungi. Most of my work, though, has really been on biomechanics, the biomechanics of the fungi. So most of my peers have really studied phylogenetic relationships among the fungi, so the evolutionary history of the fungi using genetic techniques. I've been much more interested throughout my career in the mechanics of these organisms. So the way I mentioned fungal filaments, these hyphae, the way that they actually push their way into solid materials is fascinating, plus the biochemistry of that invasive process. I've also worked with students for many years looking at the way that spores are discharged into the air. So I've said that there's vast numbers of these spores in the air. It's really interesting that we don't know how, there's whole classes of those spores, we don't know how they become airborne. So the mechanisms have not been solved at that sort of at that level of cellular biomechanics. So I find that really interesting. So most of the research that I've done really is in those areas of sort of growth, the biomechanics of growth and reproduction among the fungi. So it's sort of an esoteric field within an already esoteric field, but somebody has to do it. Well, that's what I've done in my career. But my interests are much broader than that. I'm interested in human interactions with fungi. I'm interested in the human microbiome. I'm interested in fungal genetics, and I've become really interested in fungal evolution recently, and thinking about that from a mechanical perspective also, but really getting into some of the molecular phylogenetic literature that I probably avoided when I was younger. But yeah, I suppose my interests have broadened as I've entered early middle age.
Cool. And so, how do you actually go about studying them in the research lab, and what sort of experiments are you really sort of doing?
Well, some of the experiments that I've published with students, and this is a few years ago really, that have attracted the most interest, and I keep getting correspondence on this work, is looking at these fast mechanisms of spore discharge, the way that spores are shot into the air. And I think I was fortunate in my timing about getting interested in this, because the technology of high-speed video became available sort of in the early part of this century, or rather became cost-effective in the early 2000s, after 2010 really. And this enabled researchers, including myself and collaborators, to look at these, for the first time, to actually see these fast movements under the microscope. I mean, before then, there have been beautiful studies published by investigators on the liberation of spores, and these were very clever investigators, in the sense that most of their work was based upon inference, because you could never actually see these spores moving through the air, because they were moving at such a vast clip over such a short distance. But they performed really gorgeous experiments to figure out how things worked. And so when these high-speed cameras became available, we could actually, for the first time, see these movements. And for somebody as obsessed as myself, it was really exciting just to see, for the first time anybody had seen these things fly through the air using cameras running at up to 1 million frames a second. So that was just in terms of pure drama in the lab, which is a fairly rare occurrence for all scientists. But that takes some beating. And then other experiments too, going back to when I first came to the States in the 1980s, we were interested then, or I was working in a lab that was interested in the movement of ions across the cell membranes of fungi. So ion selective channels, and then also, so fungi pump protons, charge hydrogen atoms across their membranes. They acidify their surroundings. And so that was part of what we studied. And that was interesting also from a what? It was interesting from a manipulative perspective, because we were using intracellular electrodes that are sort of more familiar to people that do electrophysiological experiments on nerve cells. But we were using these to penetrate fungal cells and measure those ion currents and voltage differences across membranes. So those are some of the experiments that I've been involved with across the great eons of time. I mean, I've just been working on a review article on some aspects of mushroom development, and I looked back. I'm not going to say again in this whole interview. I can edit that myself. I just did. I took students into the woods, which sounds really creepy, doesn't it? But I went with students. I had some of my classes of undergraduate researchers, and we did work in forest ecosystems, actually doing things like measuring the temperature of mushrooms, of fruit bodies, and that was fascinating. So experiments both at the level of individual microscopic cells, and then also on whole fruit bodies in woodland ecosystems. Yeah, I'm probably missing out some things there, but
it's all right, we might come back to them. Because you mentioned that you have interest in the evolutionary history of mushrooms. And so obviously one thing that's arisen multiple times is mutualistic relationships with different plants, termites, bees. And so I was just wondering, you also had a review recently about fungal intelligence, describing whether they have consciousness and able to make decisions. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on some of your thoughts about the intelligence of fungi.
Yeah, so there's a sort of we walk a knife edge, I think, or mycologists that are serious scientists walk along a knife edge or I do anyway, seeking to popularize the biology of the fungi without getting too woo-woo. And there's so much fantastical and crazy thinking about the fungi. And that's not me. I'm sort of the contrarian mycologist. And we could talk more about that. But with this essay that I wrote about fungal consciousness, that was stimulated by the fact that there have been some beautiful experiments performed by, not by me, but by other fungal biologists, looking at the exquisite sensitivity of fungal cells and their responsiveness to environmental cues. And these, to me, some of them reached the level of what? That they were suggestive of fungal memory. And so I thought that given actually the sloppiness of the definition of consciousness, it seemed important for somebody to actually position the fungi within that discussion about the ubiquity of consciousness, or at least sensitivity, throughout the living world. And there's been quite a lot of work on slime molds, which are not fungi, and the way they show evidence of at least short-term memory in finding food sources. Well, we see similar activity, similar responsiveness among the fungi. And so I wrote that essay to pull together some of these lines of evidence and begin to say, well, yeah, depending upon our definition of consciousness, I think it's sensible to actually suggest that fungi might possess that attribute. But it comes down to the what do we mean by consciousness? And we so privilege the human version of consciousness, and for always, really, or until very recently, we've removed the rest of life from that what level of respect? Sort of we if we go back to sort of Cartesian views of intelligence and consciousness. I mean, Descartes thought that only humans were really equipped with consciousness. They were the only conscious organisms, and the argument in Discourse on Reason begins really with the fact that we're the only organisms with language, or at least a language that Descartes could understand. And so he excluded the rest of life, but we managed to sustain that view of nature for centuries until I think relatively recently. And so now we recognize that other animals are conscious, at least those with brains, but there's no real clear dividing line between something that we would regard as conscious and something that is unconsciousness. It comes down to sensitivity to one's surroundings, responsiveness, and if we use that kind of language, we start to see that consciousness is something that is found throughout nature.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's the fact that there's no clear way of defining consciousness at the moment is hard to describe it and have the proper discussion. I mean, because I've had different definitions, and one way is to sort of categorize consciousness to different levels, with humans being on the highest level. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about it. And so, could you elaborate more on the experiments that they did to sort of test the intelligence of the fungi?
Yeah, so some of the most interesting experiments, so they're done on these fungi that in nature they engage in wood decomposition. So they feed on cellulosic biomass, wood, lignocellulosic biomass. They feed on wood. And so in the lab, you can actually grow these on culture plates, and you can feed them with little wood blocks, and it takes a while for them to grow. But some of the most interesting experiments have shown that if you provide a colony with a wood block, so I should say, so a fungus then can germinate from a single spore to produce a circular colony, and they span out in all directions equally until they find a food resource, a wood block. And then what happens is that the colony changes its behavior, changes its growth pattern to sort of privilege that area of its environment. So more cells are actually recruited, more of these filaments are recruited to grow toward that block of food. And then food is actually distributed around throughout the colony from that block of wood as it begins to be decomposed, which is a really interesting biochemical process in itself, and really quite mysterious in some ways. But I digress. When you take that, so once the colony is growing on the wood block, you can take that wood block and put it on another plate. And once it's actually exhausted the resources in that wood block, what's interesting is it tends to grow out from the same side of the wood block, sort of in the perceived direction of where it found food the last time. So it's got some kind of spatial memory. I mean, I think that's amazing. So that's one indication of this sensitivity that might be appended with the term consciousness. But you see this at the level of single cells. I mentioned experiments in which we were penetrating fungal hyphae with microelectrodes, and I'm being anthropomorphic here, but they don't like being stabbed with little glass needles, and so you see all these physical responses to the disturbance of the cell, too, again showing this great sensitivity, responsiveness to the environment, and the way that fungi grow, that we can present fungal colonies with mazes, and they will negotiate those mazes. They will change their growth form and grow over ridges. These are all examples of the complexity of the fungi, and those would be examples that I'd bring to bear to say, yeah, we've got some primitive, I suppose, form of consciousness. And I think you can do experiments and similar experiments. I mean, some of the most exquisite work really on cellular sensitivity and consciousness was performed, a lot of it in the early part of the 20th century on amoebas, on amoeba proteus and other species of amoeba. It's really, really interesting, showing them actually chasing their prey and reacting to negative stimuli. It's fascinating work, I think.
Yeah, I've seen that video a couple of times. It's often played in the undergrad lectures. But speaking of the hyphae, so that's an individual cell, and those cells can come together to form the mycelium. And so is that just one individual? Like, how do you go about defining an individual within the fungus? And maybe it's just my misunderstanding.
No, I mean that's a great question, and the issue of fungal individuality is really, really complicated. So there are some famous fungal colonies or mycelia that cover vast areas, many hectares in the United States and elsewhere, that have gotten, or some years ago then got a lot of media attention because they're so big, and there was the claim that this might be the world's largest, some of these things might be the world's largest organisms, outweigh the biomass of a blue whale, etc. Your question's a good one, though. So a fungus, a mycelium that spreads over some vast area of forest, is this an individual? Well, different parts of the colony are reacting to different food resources in different ways. They're feeding in different locations. So there is some degree of autonomy within the colony. And also, if we look at the genetics of these colonies, in some cases, they're chimeric, so their genetics differ from position to position. So does that suggest that we're dealing with a single individual or a population of fungi? It's really complicated because we can get genetic differences even among colonies that are connected physically, or there's a fluid continuity between this large mycelia, and mycelia can actually merge, they can interconnect. And so you've got two or more individuals that are actually part of this larger colony. So it's a difficult thing. How do we define an individual? But I suppose these questions really relate, and not maybe on a sort of more philosophical level, throughout nature. I mean, the more that we understand about the human body and the galaxy of microorganisms within the gut and then on the skin and elsewhere on the body. I mean, yeah, we're walking ecosystems rather than perhaps individuals. I find that interesting. And similar questions do apply to the fungi.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good point. And so besides like baker's yeast, which I've used in the labs and stuff before, they're obviously very easy to like genetically modify. These other fungal species that produce mushrooms, etc. How amenable are they to like genetic manipulation to do some of these sort of investigations?
Yeah, that's a great question because it is difficult, and yeast has dominated. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae has dominated, well, eukaryote genetics. Well, that may not be true. More than humans. I mean, they're far more important than us. But I mean, they've been a model system in eukaryotic genetics for many decades. So there are filamentous fungi that are also very amenable to genetic transformation. So there's a fungus called Neurospora crassa that's a very important system. And in fact, it was investigated by sort of early molecular geneticists, sort of before yeast, actually. So it was sort of the first model system in genetics that was a fungus. And there are other filamentous fungi that are amenable to genetic transformation. The mushroom-forming fungi are quite problematic, but there are a few. There's a model system, so it's called Coprinopsis. That's studied in with increasing brilliance, I think, by the geneticists that actually work on Coprinopsis. This is important because in terms of structural complexity, if you've got something that forms a mushroom, this is patently more. It's a more difficult lift than being a yeast, and yet we don't understand much about the genetics of mushroom formation. And so having a model system like Coprinopsis is really, really important if we're going to begin to understand the development of these, the multicellular development of the fungi. And that's been something that's been lagging for a long, long time. But I think more of my younger peers are beginning to recognize this. And so I think that's one of the most exciting areas of research now, is these sort of evo-devo studies on the fungi that have been performed on yeast for a long, long time, but taking that to the level of a fungus that produces a large macroscopic fruit body. I find that stuff really, really interesting.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, because as I was somewhat preparing for this interview, I was trying to find like the sort of latest areas of research. And I guess another question then is, where are like the hubs of research into mushrooms and fungi at the moment?
Yeah, so the work on mushroom development, there's a few labs that work on this, and I find that really fascinating. The other probably, or the more significant area of research on fungi in terms of funding priorities would be the study of pathogenic fungi, those that infect humans being of particular concern, but also the study of fungi that infect plants and crop plants in particular. I mean, it's always about us. We're such narcissists. So we'll study the fungi that are important for human health and economic activity or survival. I understand the reasons for this, but so those are the areas. So yeah, work in medical mycology is fascinating, and it certainly is an area of priority. Work on fungal pathogens of plants. But then these other areas, I mean, it's a niche area, evolutionary development of mushrooms. But I find it exciting.
And well, since you brought it up about the interactions between fungi and humans, obviously one thing I've always found fascinating and I've spoken about multiple times on my channel is the gut microbiome. And I always talk about bacteria, and I always fail to mention the attributes to fungi that are also living within us and on us. Right. And so how many of them are pathogenic, or like what is the beneficial contributions of fungi to human health?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So some of the fungi that we find in the gut, for example, in a healthy gut, can become problematic under conditions where our immune system is debilitated or we suffer some form of physical injury. So the fungi that tend to cause many of the fungi that cause problems in human health are opportunistic pathogens. So they become life-threatening. They can form life-threatening infections when we're damaged, when we're compromised in some way, as I say, either through immune damage or through some physical damage, like a severe burn. So we could talk about some of the fungi, the fungi that cause human infections, but in terms of the positive effects of the fungi on human health, so those come in a number of different forms. One is that fungi interact with bacteria and other microorganisms in the gut and elsewhere, and establish what a sort of a workable microbial ecosystem within a place like the gut, where things work in balance and we don't see an overgrowth of one particular kind of microorganism. And so that's part of it, is in terms of their interactions with bacteria and actually supporting what we regard as a healthy ecosystem. On the skin surface, we find fungi that are very important appear to be very important in skin health. Fungi really are found on every scrap of the skin surface, but there's a lot of interest in fungi yeasts that grow on the scalp and actually consume the sebum, so some of the waxy secretions on the scalp. And these appear to be a part of a healthy microbiome on the skin surface. The way that they're actually operating there is, in many cases, this is emerging science, but it could be through, again, by controlling the growth of bacteria, producing antibacterial compounds. I guess we'd regard them as, we call them antibiotics in that location, but also doing things like degrading skin cells as they're shed from the skin surface, and actually decomposing those skin cells, this waste material, having effects upon the pH of the skin. So there's probably a lot more effects of these fungi on the skin surface than we recognize. Some of them are deleterious, but also these are a natural part of the human ecosystem. So, yeah.
That's interesting, because I definitely agree that that's underexplored at the moment. But it just made me think that obviously there's always these talks about probiotics and beneficial like foods you should eat that would support your bacterial growth, the good bacteria in the gut. But I suppose maybe there'll be ways of trying to enhance your fungal microbiome or something at some point. I could imagine that being.
There are actually. So there is at least one probiotic that seems to have, with sort of decent supporting evidence that this is useful in gut health, particularly for somebody that suffers from food poisoning, for example, when they travel and they suffer from very severe diarrhea. There's a probiotic yeast strain that seems to be somewhat effective in resetting gut health and allowing the natural supportive gut microbiome to reboot. And so, that's definitely an area of active research that I suspect is going to grow in the future. But it's also an area of medicine that sort of buyer beware, because there are a lot of claims made for products that of no sort of demonstrated efficacy.
Well, speaking of healthcare, then, obviously a lot of us eat mushrooms. What is like the just general nutritional value of mushroom consumption?
The mushrooms have no nutritional value whatsoever. So let me, if we're looking for a source of calories, mushrooms are a really, really poor source of calories. They've got a hydroskeleton, because the mushrooms are formed from hundreds of thousands or millions of hyphae, and they get pumped up with water, they generate pressure, and that's how the mushroom emerges. But in terms of their calorific value, they're very, very low. So they're good for one's diet if you want to actually reduce consumption of energy, of calories. They contain traces of useful nutrients, but nothing that you wouldn't get through other components of your diet. So they're very low in soluble sugars. They are a source of what? What's their use in diet? They're a source of soluble and insoluble fiber. So that's a good part of your diet. I mean, most of the reason that I think we enjoy mushrooms is that they add texture to our food, but we're not eating them because of their sort of inherent, certainly in terms of their nutritional value. There may be exceptions to this, but these are unproven at this point. So there's a huge amount of interest in the medicinal or health promoting effects of different mushrooms in the diet. But I regard most of those studies as being suspect. I want to show me the evidence. Show me more evidence that these really have a positive effect upon human health. There's a lot of wishful thinking that goes on in that area. So I'm not talking about mushrooms that are the mushroom extracts that are sold as medicinal supplements, but in terms of mushrooms in the diet, they can be a useful part of the diet. They certainly make our diet the food that we eat more interesting. Some of them have interesting flavors. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but
no, you did perfectly.
Calorie for calorie, in fact, interesting. I mean, you can look this up. I mean, it's like lettuce. So if you're starving, lettuce isn't going to keep you going. You'd have to eat an awful lot of lettuce unless you're a manatee or something like that. And then indeed you do eat enormous amounts of plants with relatively low caloric value. But yeah.
So actually, one of the questions I was going to ask, and you sort of already touched upon it, was from reading your book, you had a sort of like a more of a negative opinion on some of the health claims that are made regarding some specific species of mushrooms. And so I was going to ask if your views have changed since like the 10 or so years since the book was first published.
You've read the mushroom. I've written so many books on fungi. So yeah, I also published an article in 2015 that was titled "Are Mushrooms Medicinal?" that reviewed a lot of the literature on medicinal mushrooms and found it lacking. And now, 8 years later, I haven't changed my opinion at all. I mean, in terms of placebo-controlled, double-blinded clinical trials on the effects of mushrooms, the evidence is lacking. Nevertheless, this is a very lucrative industry for companies that sell medicinal mushrooms with all kinds of claims about their effects, their efficacy in treating conditions that are very sort of mild conditions, but also even life-threatening diseases, terminal illnesses. It's an area of, I suppose we'd call it mycology, but it drives me crazy because I don't like to see mushrooms and mushroom science misrepresented in this way. There are some areas of research, though, on medicinal mushrooms that are more promising. One of those is, there's a mushroom called lion's mane that produces a number of compounds that have been studied, so isolated and studied in their purified form. Most of the work's been done on tissue cultured cells, neurites, nerve cells. And so these compounds seem to promote the growth and the proliferation of nerve cells in culture. There have been some experiments on lab rodents also with these compounds from lion's mane that maybe show some interesting effects upon the nervous system. And so it's plausible that there are compounds present in mushrooms that have remarkable pharmacological effects. But all I've pushed for in my writing is for some serious science to be done. But as I say, this is being done on some of these compounds from lion's mane. There are also compounds called beta-glucans that are present in pretty much all, well, in all fungal cell walls. Those may have some interesting effects. Those compounds do have some interesting effects upon the immune system, and so in terms of the immune reactions within the gut, so they clearly actually stimulate an immune response. But whether these effects can be captured in the form of a drug that might have, real medicinal uses, I think we're some way away from that. So that's really what that's what I'm saying, is that we just need more research on these compounds. And at the moment, it's a case of buyer beware, and the claims that are made for miracle cures they're just beyond all bounds of plausibility. But it's not surprising, is it? I mean, when people are diagnosed with conditions that don't respond well to prescription drugs that we get from our physicians, it's not surprising that they're looking for other approaches to treating ailments. I mean, we've always done this. But mushrooms are promising in a medicinal sense, I think, because if we look at mushrooms in the woods, where they're surrounded by microorganisms of all kinds, there are nematodes, soil nematodes, there are insects that deposit their eggs in mushrooms and so forth, and yet mushrooms survive for days in these beautiful forms and release their spores very effectively. They must be producing an incredible array of biologically active compounds that affect the physiology of microorganisms, but also insects and other invertebrates. And so that leads me to be more optimistic about the presence of medically useful compounds in mushrooms. It's just that we haven't identified what these compounds may be. Antibiotics, we know, of course, that the great antibiotics isolated from not mushroom-forming fungi, but fungi that we call ascomycete fungi, so relatives of yeast. But all fungi probably produce antibiotics in one form or another, and we just don't know a lot about the properties of these compounds. There are these beautiful mushrooms tiny things called bird's nest fungi that produce little nests with fungal eggs that are full of spores, and they get flicked into the air by raindrops. But the bird's nest fungi produce an amazing array of antibiotics that have been studied by biochemists, and it's possible in the future this might lead to the development of new families of antibiotics that could be useful for treating bacterial infections in us.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned some of these points, because as I was somewhat researching for this discussion, I think because of what I was looking at, I ended up getting a lot of adverts for different health products that, like coffee and whatnot, that have different extracts from different mushrooms in. And so then I did look at some of them, like lion's mane, and also shiitake mushroom came up a lot, and turkey's tail, and some of them have the claims seem to be attributed to these glucans, as you mentioned, that seems to somewhat be stimulating the immune system. But then I think you sort of touched on the question, which is it always such a good thing to be overstimulating or activating immune cells? And so then I came across another study where a guy had, it's like an N-1 case study, where he'd consumed a lot of shiitake mushrooms whilst in Tokyo, and he then had dermatitis on his skin. So the skin rash went after a couple of days, but who knows if it was the mushroom that caused it after consumption. But then when I was then thinking about these supplements or these sort of powders that they're like concentrated versions, maybe one mushroom by itself is okay, but I don't know. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's the idea that stimulating the immune system is Yeah, there's been actually quite a lot written about this by immunologists that are very skeptical. But the idea of sort of stimulating the immune, I mean, an asthma attack is a stimulus, is generated by stimulus to the immune system. So it's not necessarily a good thing to do to walk around hyper inflamed. I mean, it's a bizarre claim, isn't it? It needs some thinking. It needs some further thinking. It's like the claims that are made about antioxidants. I mean, antioxidants in our diet, and the way that if we eat foods that are very high in antioxidants, this is something that's going to be beneficial. Maybe that's a broader issue, but the idea that stimulate the immune system that we need to be eating. Yeah, even the definition of antioxidants is pretty curious in the hands of some food manufacturers.
So you'd be pretty skeptical in any product at the moment out there that has some sort of mushroom extracts?
I would be. Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence.
And so besides some of like the health claims, there's also obviously been some interest in understanding the psychedelic compounds that are also found in mushrooms. The notable ones being psilocybin, which comes from one species or one family of the Psilobi? I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Yeah, so psilocybin, which is the active compound, and then after we ingest psilocybin, it's converted to psilocin that actually interacts with the nervous system. But it's actually produced by a few hundred species of mushrooms. And it's interesting, well, anyway, a few hundred species of mushrooms, and not all of them are actually members of the same tight grouping. And so whether the biochemical pathway to generate psilocybin has evolved more than once is an interesting question. But yeah, so it's a few hundred. But the source for psilocybin, well, the commercialized source for it is really, it's mainly one species that's grown as the source of psilocybin, but tremendous interest in the properties of this alkaloid, psilocin. Yeah, it really is interesting. So I'm sure you're aware there's been some extremely good science done on psilocybin. So it's sort of these magic mushrooms have escaped their countercultural association, and there are many voices that suggest that these compounds should be used as a part of mainstream medicine for treating conditions like PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, forms of clinical depression that don't respond to conventional antidepressants, and other conditions, and as mood elevators in people that have been diagnosed with a terminal illness. I mean, they seem to have these remarkable properties in making people view their lives differently, and in many cases reducing the symptoms of chronic depression and so forth. It's an area of research that requires a lot more investigation also. There is some bias in many of these experiments, and there are certainly some patients that react very negatively to these compounds, but this is something that should be studied further, in my view. And then there are a number of states in the United States where the use of these mushrooms the use of psilocybin has been legalized, at least within clinics that are regulated by the states. So yeah, it's really interesting. And there was a study published just a few weeks ago about the action of psilocin, which is interesting. So it mimics serotonin, but what's interesting about this compound is it seems to actually be able to penetrate nerve cells and actually interact with interact with serotonin receptors that actually exist intracellularly, which is really interesting. So it's through this process of methylation of the compound that enables it becomes more soluble. It penetrates cell membranes more easily, and then it's actually got these effects inside cells. And so this might be part of the whole business about why the perceived effects of these compounds is so profound. It's such a game changer for people that use psilocybin. That it could be that it's actually entering the cells of the nervous system. It's not proven. I think it's mostly in vitro. It's work on cells that have been cultured cells, but I don't know, it's just another interesting part of this investigative journey, and the fact that we're looking at, or other scientists are looking at, the effects of psilocin on the level of individual cells and so forth is really, really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I mean, I guess part of the mechanism then might be that there's like vesicles forming within the cells and they're getting transported to the membrane, and maybe obviously I've not read the paper and I'm speculating on potential mechanisms.
Yeah.
But as well, I guess the conversion of individual differences of going from psilocybin to psilocin within the body is going to be different, potentially between different people.
Yeah. I mean, getting back to philosophy, it's interesting though too that why is it in the human condition that so many people feel that their life experience is enhanced by consuming this material? I suppose it's the same thing with other compounds that change the behavior of our nervous system, that change our moods. But yeah, it's interesting.
And then, then it also raises the question as to why are the mushrooms making these compounds? Is it beneficial for the mushroom? Like the abundance in the mushrooms suggests maybe it's doing something interesting.
That's actually much more interesting. To me, that's much more interesting than the effects on the human body. Again, because present company accepted, my view of humans is pretty bleak. But yeah, why do mushrooms? Because they've been producing them for tens, hundreds of millions of years, or at least tens of millions of years. That's really interesting. I mean, the prevailing view is that they evolved to affect interactions between the fungal fruit body, the reproductive organ, and insects. But the evidence for this is still pretty limited. But that seems to be the case. And there's experiments that suggest that psilocybin has profound effects upon the nervous system of insects, and so that's probably it. It relates to the way that mushrooms interact with insects. Then the question is, are mushrooms trying to ward off the insects? Probably not. And probably with something that's affecting their nervous system. There's something about they want to attract insects, and there's something about the way that it affects the nervous system of the insect. And in that case, why would a fungus want to attract an insect? Well, then it comes down to the distribution of spores. So mushroom spores are dispersed by wind, but insects are important accessories as agents of dispersal in carrying spores away from mushrooms. So that may be where part of the answer lies then, is actually in attracting insects to fruit bodies through sort of coevolution.
Yeah, because as you say, I mean, obviously they've been doing this way before we existed. Although, like that said, I came across some other theories about how human intelligence potentially was enhanced by, I guess, early hominids consuming mushrooms that contain psychedelic compounds. It's some sort of theory or hypothesis. I'm not sure what.
Yeah, it's referred to as the stoned ape hypothesis.
That's it. Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Absolutely. How dare they suggest this? I mean, it's obviously we don't have evidence for this. It is interesting how far people will stretch credulity. I mean, there are some interesting. There are rock paintings, very ancient rock paintings, that appear to show mushrooms, and probably humans have been ingesting magic mushrooms for a very, very long time. and our hominid relatives and ancestors too. So this is something that's happened. But whether this is responsible for the brilliance of the human brain, I probably not. Probably not.
And
The supposed brilliance of the human brain.
but besides the psilocybin, there's other like the flight agaric mushroom that produces like slightly different compounds, right? And so I guess it comes back to the question of how much unexplored potential compounds are out there in different species. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that relates to that, and then the issue of these other. I mean, yes, absolutely. So compounds in fly agarics that have different effects upon the nervous system. That's right, but it relates to this idea of all of these compounds within mushrooms that are designed by natural selection to interact with animal tissues, and so yeah, a lot more work to be done. A great area for fungal biochemists.
I mean, being a biochemist, I'm like naturally intrigued by all these questions, and then like what genes are regulating it and whatnot. But yeah, super fascinating. And then just speaking about just like current research in fungi as well, I saw some interesting video about how fungi were able to sort of clear up an oil spill, and I was just curious if you have any thoughts about other like alternative applications of mushrooms and fungi, because I've also seen like companies making like leather mimics out of growing mushrooms.
Yeah. So the idea with oil spills and using fungi to ameliorate the effects of pollution. So this is an area it's referred to as mycoremediation, or at least some people call it mycoremediation. Fungi do produce such an amazing array of enzymes that can break down all kinds of chemical compounds. And indeed, many of the hydrocarbons that are produced by oil and gas industries, there are fungi that will break down these compounds or parts of them. Whether or not these can be used on a level, it's a matter of scale. So certainly in a lab experiment, we can show that these fungi can degrade and in some cases detoxify these compounds. But whether that can be used on a scale to deal with an oil spill, I must admit I'm quite skeptical. And similarly, there's interest in using fungi. They have a cleansing effect upon soils and a cleansing effect upon groundwater, but and we see this in forest ecosystems. But whether we can use these same fungi to actually to remediate an area that's been damaged by coal mining, for example, again, I think it's a matter of scale, and I'm skeptical. I mean, I think I'm a realist, but there are certainly companies that are looking at this, and hey, wonderful if this can be actually produced and commercialized. But it's I think in so many cases we're guilty of wishful thinking that there's a paper that shows that this particularly unpleasant organic compound can be biodegraded by a fungus, but it's a matter of scale.
So evidently from our discussion, mushrooms have and will continue to play an important role in not just our lives, but the future of the planet. And so just other areas of interest of mine have been in terms of like future foods and how mushrooms seem to be able to grow and lots of sort of waste products. And so what do you think are the major questions that need to be addressed in the field of fungal biology? That's kind of a big question.
Wow, that's a big question. I mentioned something earlier which is interesting, and it does relate to food production on cellulosic, lignocellulosic wastes, right? That you can grow mushrooms on those materials. And so this is perhaps important for recycling and in growing mushrooms that could be, part of our diet. The actual mechanisms that fungi use, so this is for you as a biochemist, to actually break down lignocellulose, a lot of this is really quite mysterious. So there are fungi that are brown rock fungi that are capable of, they don't actually break down the lignin polymers within wood, but they work around them and break down the cellulose. And the cellulose is decomposed just to release glucose, and that's how their metabolism is fueled. But the way that they can extract or break down the cellulose without actually having to remove the lignin is not clear. So there's some really interesting research in that area. So just figuring out some of the fundamentals of the way that decomposition works, that it's that's really fascinating to me. What else is interesting? There are some fascinating questions within the evolution of mushrooms. So there are lots and lots of kinds of mushrooms that don't release their spores into the air. So the way that a mushroom with gills works is the spores actually jump off the gill surfaces and they fall between the little spaces between gills, and then they're swept away by air currents. But there's lots and lots of different mechanisms that mushrooms use, alternative mechanisms that mushrooms use to disperse their spores. So there are stink horns that create these awful smells that attract insects, carrion flies, for example, that eat the spores and then carry them and disperse them in when they defecate. There are puffballs whose spores are shot into the air when the fruit body's compressed by raindrops. There's all kinds of other mechanisms out there. What's not clear is why these different, and truffles too, some truffles, we tend to call them false truffles, that are mushrooms that remain below ground, and they're dispersed by animals that dig for them and then consume the truffle. This is a process that's evolved many, many times, at least 80 different times in the evolution of the whole mushroom, diversity of mushrooms. And it's not clear why this happened. Spore release involving wind is such an efficient mechanism for dispersing spores. There's some really interesting questions there about why, and then how these different mechanisms actually evolved. And unfortunately, there's been so much extinction that's occurred during the history of the mushrooms that we're left with these sort of bizarre mechanisms of spore dispersal, and we have no idea about how they evolved. And so there's some really interesting questions there that interest me, because I'm interested in the way that spores work. What else? There's all kinds of interesting questions about the fungi. Their interactions with the human body, I mean, we talked about those. I mean, how is it that they really do, how is it that they actually act in a beneficial fashion? Are they, just benign and they don't have a positive effect on the body? Or if not, what are the positive effects of the fungi that grow in the gut through these interactions with bacteria and also on their own? So there's many, many questions about the fungi. I mean, and we've touched on some of them here in our conversation about why fungi in the end produce these psychoactive compounds. Actually having some real answers to that question would be fascinating, and looking at interactions between fungi and insects, I think, will be fascinating. Lots and lots of other questions, and we don't have time for it, but there's lots of work on mycorrhizal fungi, so mushroom-forming fungi and others that interact with most plants and forest trees in particular. That's really interesting areas of research there on that mutualistic symbiosis between fungi and the roots of forest trees. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities for interesting research on fungi.
For sure, yeah. And I would recommend to my viewers, if they're interested, to firstly read the book Mushroom, because I think it's a fascinating and great overview of the many different areas that we've touched upon. But I know that you've also written many other books, and so I thought I'd just give you the chance to sort of give a bit of a quick summary of some of the other books that you've written, because they've touched upon very different topics.
Well, I'd just say for there is a sort of almost more popular version of the book that you read, the mushroom book. It's out in paperback now. So mushrooms are natural and cultural history, and it's lavishly illustrated too, for people that have a short attention span. No, it's brilliant. Look at the pictures. So that's a book. But I've actually written other books too. That the books that are read most widely actually are part of the Oxford University Press series called Very Short Introductions. So I wrote the Very Short Introduction to Fungi. So it's 30,000 words, best introduction to fungal biology available to humanity. And so that's good. I also wrote the one on microbiology, which is probably due for an update now, but that's also a short book. And then probably the most controversial thing that I've written, I wrote a book called The Selfish Ape, which is about us, with reaction books in London. And so there's almost no mention of fungi in that book, but that's about our inevitable extinction. So that would be a subject for a different non-mycological interview. But I'm actually working on a book now on fungal medicine, so about these interactions between the human body and fungal biology. Fungal biology and human biology. Yeah, so don't really have a title for that yet, but that's an interesting and a big project. Yeah.
For sure, yeah, because I was actually about to ask you, like, what is next? And so clearly this book is on the horizon.
Yeah, I think that, looking at the biomedical aspects of our interactions with the fungi is one of my goals. And yeah.
Cool. And so I always like to sort of end the interviews with asking for like advice, not just for like, I guess in this case specifically about consumers and advice on mushrooms, but more for like students as well who were interested in like the sort of career path that you followed. Is there any sort of advice that you would want to give to other students?
Yeah, it's advice for students. The most important thing for an undergraduate that's actually thinking of embarking on an advanced degree, this is my advice to my students here. I work at Miami University, which is in Oxford, Ohio, and the advice I have for students here is to pick an advisor rather than a university. So there's obviously there's a premium upon attending one of the flagship universities in this country. But I think a student can often do as well or better by just picking a really good advisor. So that often actually means a younger advisor, somebody that's really early in their career path. They're very eager to work with students and passionate about their own area of research. And a professor of that kind, those professors might work in any number of universities, whose names are not as well known as the Ivy League schools in this country. But I think an ambitious student can do really well working with an advisor that's really committed to their research. And so find somebody whose research you find really interesting. That's certainly what I did as a student. And what? Let entropy be your guide. I don't know. It's but finding something. I mean, embarking on a graduate degree in a field that doesn't really interest you, I suppose nobody would possibly do that, I'm sure. But finding something that really turns you on, I think, is critical. And so,
I think that's good advice. And for anyone listening who's interested in, I guess, learning more about fungal biology, where can they find out more about your research, and where can I redirect my viewers?
So I've got a website, so it's The Mycologist, there's only one, themycologist.com. And so there's a list of books there, and I've got a blog that I plop an essay on there from time to time. But yeah, that would be the source, and anybody that would like to contact me can do so through the website.
Okay, great. I'll put a link to that in the description. So thank you again, Nik, for coming on today. I felt like we've done a massive overview on all things fungi, so that's been great. And hope you've had a fun time too.
Oh, very good. Yes, thank you. It was a fascinating conversation, and as you said, very broad-ranging. If you ever have me back, unlikely, but if you ever have me back, we talk about one thing. We'll talk about one membrane protein found in filamentous fungi, and that we could fill an hour with that.
I'm sure. That'd be super fun for sure.
Very good.
Great, thank you. So I hope you've learned something in this video. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, and thank you for listening.